They ignored him, mocked him, and set him up to fail, until one quiet boy sat at a dusty piano and made the entire school listen like never before. At Summit Grove Middle School in the town of Ashton Hill, where tree-lined streets swayed gently in the breeze and church bells rang every Sunday noon, Noah Bennett quietly walked into his literature class, just like any other day. The 14-year-old boy, slender but sharp-eyed, always arrived early, his books neatly stacked and his assignments completed. But despite all his efforts, he remained a shadow in that classroom, especially in the eyes of Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, a white man with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, always maintained a serious demeanor in class, but everyone could see his bias. When Zach Whitmore, the son of a local tycoon, spoke, Mr. Delaney would nod in approval, even if the answer was hollow. But when Noah raised his hand, even if his response had been carefully thought out, the teacher's eyes would merely pass over him, as if he didn't exist. Noah wasn't a troublemaker. He didn't skip class or talk out of turn. He simply studied hard, quietly, waiting for a moment to be heard. But day after day, silence remained the only reply. And what hurt most wasn't the dismissal. It was the look in Mr. Delaney's eyes whenever Noah answered correctly. Not surprise, not praise, just a fleeting frown, as if Noah's excellence was something difficult to accept. At home, Noah never told his mother, Mrs. Danielle, who had sacrificed so much for him to have a place at this school. And Noah didn't want to worry her. But deep inside, the injustice gnawed at him like a dull headache, not painful enough to scream, but always there. He'd gotten used to skeptical glances, the quiet snickers whenever Zach mocked his curly hair or his distinct way of speaking. But he never talked back. Noah simply held his head high, remembered every detail, and promised himself one day they would have a look at him differently. On Monday morning, the literature class felt colder than usual, not because of the weather, but because of the way Mr. Delaney looked at Noah as he walked in. The same quiet, scrutinizing gaze, as if Noah didn't quite belong among the neatly arranged desks and clean whiteboard. Today's topic was the American dream in 20th century literature. Noah had read ahead, taken careful notes. He was eager, convinced he could offer a different, more honest perspective on things that students like him were rarely allowed to say. When Mr. Delaney asked, "What does Gatsby represent in the American dream?" Noah's hand shot up almost immediately. Mr. Delaney glanced at him with a moment of hesitation, then called another name, Zach. Even though Zach merely repeated a few lines in the textbook, the teacher smiled approvingly. "Well done, Zach." That was a very thoughtful answer. Noah lowered his hand, lips pressed tightly together. He wasn't surprised, just empty. Mr. Delaney never yelled at Noah, never insulted him outright, but it was what he didn't say that hurt the most. The deliberate absence of recognition, the encouragement given to every student, except him. And it didn't just come from Mr. Delaney. In art class, Ms. Madison praised Lena's drawing, very expressive, very creative, while Noah's detailed illustration received only a brief nod. In science, Mr. Taylor gave Zach's group extra time to present, but when Noah asked for 3 more minutes, the teacher coolly replied, "Time is equal for everyone." No one ever said Noah wasn't talented. They just acted as if he wasn't good enough, so that when he got something right, they called it luck. It wasn't that they hated him and wanted him to fail. They wanted him to fail to reinforce a quiet belief that kids like him, black kids from the other side of town, couldn't really be excellent. And Noah knew. He felt it in every glance, every lukewarm compliment, and especially in the long, uncomfortable silences that followed each correct answer he gave. But he also knew something else. The silence didn't erase him. It only made him more determined. That day's literature class began like any other. The rustling of papers, the distracted stares of students, and Mr. Delaney's steady voice humming through the silence like a ticking clock. Noah sat by the window as usual, quietly taking notes, expecting nothing more than to get through the class in peace, until Mr. Delaney suddenly closed his lesson plan and smiled, a strange kind of smile, the kind Noah had learned to be wary of. "Everyone," he said, hands clasped behind his back, "I thought we'd do something a little different today." The room buzzed with whispers. Zach raised an eyebrow. Lena muttered something to the girl beside her. Noah stayed silent. Mr. Delaney walked toward Noah's desk. "Noah, I heard you play the piano." Noah froze. The question didn't feel casual. "Why, yes, sir," he answered slowly, feeling dozens of eyes turned toward him. "Wonderful. Then I'd like you to prepare a piece and perform it for the class tomorrow," Mr. Delaney said gently. But in his eyes, Noah didn't see encouragement, only a challenge dressed in sugar. The room erupted in whispers. Zach chuckled out loud. "Man, I bet he can't even play, for he's a jolly good fellow." Noah didn't respond. He looked at Mr. Delaney and nodded. "Yes, sir." But inside, he understood exactly what this was. Not an invitation, but a trap. A test designed to make him stumble, to make him the punchline, so that Mr. Delaney could later say, "I gave him a chance." The lesson continued, but Noah heard none of it. His mind had already drifted back to the old piano in the living room, where his grandfather used to sit for hours, teaching him each key, each rhythm, and gently saying, "Music isn't about proving anything. Music is how you say the things no one wants to hear." They thought they were setting a trap for him, but instead, they had unknowingly opened the door for Noah to tell his story. That evening, the small house on the corner of Magnolia Street was quieter than usual. In the living room, the soft glow of the lamp fell across the old piano, its paint chipped in places. Ivory keys faded to a yellowish tint. But to Noah, it wasn't just an instrument. It was where his grandfather once sat. It had been 2 years since his grandfather, the only one who had seen Noah's talent since he was little, quietly left this world. But the memory of those afternoons at his grandfather's home, when the air was filled with gentle blues melodies, still lived vividly in Noah's heart. Every time he placed his hands on the keys, he could almost feel his grandfather's warm hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Don't play for them to listen, Noah. Play because you've got something to say." Noah sat down, took a deep breath. Outside, the autumn breeze rustled the trees, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat, anxious yet excited. He began to practice. Not some easy listening pop song or a grand classical piece. Noah chose a blues composition, the kind his grandfather had taught him, echoing with the soul of southern dreams, sorrow, struggle, and the quiet thread of hope. The music rose and fell, at times soft like stove smoke curling into the air, at others sharp enough to slice through silence. In the kitchen, his mother, Danielle, froze mid-motion when she heard the first notes. She didn't step out, but stood still behind the doorframe, one hand gripping the wooden frame. In that music, she heard the voice of her father, gone now, but alive again through her son's fingertips. After about 40 minutes without pause, Noah stopped. He leaned back on the bench, palms sweaty. Though there had been no audience, it felt like he had just completed a performance. He knew tomorrow would be unlike any day that came before. At school, the buzz had already begun. Zach sneered every time he saw him. "You ready, Junior Ray Charles?" He snickered in the hallway, drawing a few giggles from others. But there were different kind of looks, too. Lena glanced at Noah quietly, her expression thoughtful, and Jalen gave him a light pat on the shoulder. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes told Noah what he needed to know. He wasn't alone. That night, lying in bed, Noah didn't think about being praised or ridiculed. He thought of just one thing. Tomorrow, when his fingers touched those keys, he wouldn't be a black student trying to prove something. He would be a storyteller, speaking the one language they couldn't twist or silence: music. On Friday morning, the sky over Ashton Hill hung gray, like a weight. In Mr. Delaney's literature class, everything moved slower than usual. Students whispered among themselves, eyes drifting toward the old piano in the corner of the room, usually only touched during holiday events. Mr. Delaney entered the classroom with his usual composed demeanor. He adjusted his tie, opened the grade book, and then, as if he had just remembered, looked up with a strange smile. "Today, we have a special performance. Noah Bennett will play a piece on the piano." There were no applause, no words of encouragement, just a few stifled giggles from the back of the room. Zach muttered under his breath, "Let's hope you don't break a key." Noah stood up. He walked slowly toward the piano, each step echoing sharply on the tile floor. He didn't bow his head. He didn't smile. He simply sat down, adjusted the bench, and opened the lid, as if he'd done it hundreds of times before. The room gradually fell silent. Mr. Delaney stood by the whiteboard, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Noah like he was waiting for a misstep. But Noah didn't tremble. He placed his hands on the keys, closed his eyes, and began. The first notes rose like a soft whisper. It was blues. It was sorrow and pride. It was the sound of country winds mingling with the rumble of trains crossing landscapes soaked in memory. Noah wasn't just playing the piano. He was telling a story. With every rhythm, every note, every lingering pause that vibrated through the room. The story was about children who went unseen, unheard, about quiet evenings practicing alone, about his grandfather, whose words still echoed in his ears. Music is the voice when the world refuses to listen. No one said a word. Even Zach had stopped smiling. Lena, who usually kept to herself, now sat upright, her eyes following every movement on the keyboard. Jalen nodded slightly, the pride on his face impossible to hide. As Noah reached the climax, the notes swelled with conviction. No one dared interrupt. No gaze dared look away. He finished with a deep, sustained chord. His hand stilled. No bow, no expectation of praise, just silence. And in that moment, silence was its own kind of triumph. A round of applause broke out, scattered at first, then spreading throughout the room. Even students who had once ignored him couldn't help but acknowledge what they had just witnessed. Zach, who had been slouched back in his seat, was now sitting upright, hands clenched on the edge of his desk, eyes locked on Noah. Lena lowered her head, her fingers intertwined, as if trying to hide an emotion she couldn't name. Some students exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to speak or remain quiet. And Mr. Delaney, the man whose face rarely changed, no matter what, now stood motionless for a moment. His hand trembled slightly as he closed the gray book. The way he looked at Noah was no longer blank or dismissive. It was something new, a mix of surprise, uncertainty, and disorientation. As for Noah, he simply walked back to his seat, like nothing had happened, but everyone in the room knew. Everything had changed. All right. Mr. Delaney's voice broke the silence, hoarse. Let's continue with the lesson. But everyone knew nothing could ever continue as usual again. From that morning on, the atmosphere at Summit Grove Middle School wasn't the same. Though no one said a word, every glance had shifted. When Noah walked into class after lunch, the usual averted gazes had turned into quiet attention. Some curiosity, a bit of caution, and something he had never seen before, respect. Zach no longer made snide remarks. He simply glanced at Noah as he walked past, then quickly looked away, as if still trying to digest the music he'd heard that morning. Lena, who typically avoided all interaction, smiled at Noah in the hallway for the first time. Not overly friendly, but enough to let him know she saw him now. Even Mr. Delaney couldn't fully maintain his detached composure. During literature class that day, he glanced at Noah 3 times, something that had never happened. When Noah raised his hand to speak, Mr. Delaney paused for a few seconds, his eyes caught in a quiet internal conflict, then gave a small nod. Go ahead, Noah. Just 4 words. But to Noah, they carried the weight of melody played at the perfect moment. The entire class turned toward him, not in surprise, but because they wanted to hear what he had to say. Noah spoke calmly, a thoughtful analysis of the main character in To Kill a Mockingbird. His voice was clear, measured. He didn't say much, just enough to show everyone that the performance wasn't a lucky moment. He had always had the ability. They just hadn't bothered to listen. After class, as Noah stepped into the hallway, Jalen came up beside him and gave him a light nudge. You know what? Everyone's been talking about you all day. Some kids ask where you learned to play piano. Others want to know if you play anything else. That was sick, man. Noah just smiled, not out of pride, but because finally his voice, whether spoken or played, had been heard. From that day forward, no one could treat Noah like a shadow again, and the looks he received, still tinged with surprise, no longer came from people in power, but from people beginning to relearn how to see another human being with their heart. 3 days after the piano performance, the air in Mr. Delaney's literature class still carried its echoes. The way Noah had silenced the room, with music alone, was still being murmured about in the halls. But Mr. Delaney was different. He said nothing. No mention of the performance. No formal response. It was a silence not of acceptance, but of wounded pride. On Wednesday morning, Mr. Delaney entered the classroom with a thick stack of handouts, speaking in his usual flat tone. Today, we'll be analyzing a passage from To Kill a Mockingbird. I want a quick presentation from one student. Anyone? The room went still, and no one was surprised when his eyes landed on Noah. Noah Bennett, you seem to enjoy performing. Then tell the class about the symbol of the mockingbird in the novel. A few glances were exchanged around the room. It was clear this wasn't an opportunity. It was a test. Noah calmly stood up. His hand rested on the desk. His eyes locked on Mr. Delaney. His voice rang out, steady and clear. The mockingbird is a symbol of innocence and purity, creatures that bring only music and joy, but are harmed by prejudice and cruelty. A quiet hush spread through the classroom. Then Noah continued, and when someone shoots a mockingbird, it's not because it did anything wrong, but because they believe it doesn't deserve a voice. That final sentence struck a chord, taut and unflinching. Mr. Delaney froze. He inhaled sharply, opening his mouth to respond, but Noah gently spoke first. If anyone can memorize a piece of music, sir, then why did you assume I would fail? The class held its breath, not because it was disrespectful, but because it was justified. Noah wasn't angry. He simply asked, and that question forced everyone in the room to confront a truth they had long avoided. Mr. Delaney turned away, his jaw clenched. He didn't answer, because he couldn't. And for the first time since the school year began, Noah was no longer the shadow at the back of the room. He was a voice, not loud, not demanding, just present, timely, and clear. From that discussion onward, the literature class was never the same. No one said aloud, but everyone felt it. Something had shifted deeply and definitively. An invisible line between the overlooked and the respected had been erased. Mr. Delaney still taught as usual, still stood at the front of the room, voice steady, as if nothing had happened. But Noah knew the truth. Mr. Delaney could no longer ignore him, could no longer dismiss his answers or cut him off mid-thought. The silence in his pauses, the quick glances toward Noah, was his quiet admission. And strangely enough, Noah didn't need praise. He felt it in the subtle nods from Lena every time he spoke, in the way Jalen, his only friend in the room, now always chose to sit beside him instead of in the back. Even in the lowered gaze of Zach Whitmore, the rich kid who once sneered, now looking down as he passed Noah in the hallway. One late afternoon, after class had ended, Noah was packing up his books when Lena Wright approached. The curly-haired girl who had always kept to herself, who had never spoken to him before. She hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "The way you played, it was like telling a story full of things people are too afraid to say." Noah looked up. The sentence needed no explanation. He gave a small smile and replied, "Thanks. I just said it in a way they couldn't interrupt." Lena nodded, then walked away. No fanfare, no spotlight, but Noah felt it. He had been seen. He didn't need a grand stage or roaring applause. Just one look of acknowledgement, one honest whisper, one silence that made the whole room listen. Noah had changed the way people saw him, not with his voice, but with a presence they could no longer ignore. And he knew that sometimes the quietest victories echo the loudest. No one said out loud, but after performance, Noah was no longer the shadow in the classroom. During recess, as Noah walked down the hallway, the looks he received were no longer blank or evasive. Instead, they were curious, sometimes accompanied by a nod or a faint smile. Names that had once forgotten he existed now called out to him. "Noah, that was awesome the other day. Noah, how did you solve that math problem?" He wasn't used to this kind of attention, but he accepted it with calm, just like he had learned every measure of every piece, every glide of his fingers on the piano keys, unrushed, unassuming. To Noah, respect didn't need applause. It just needed to not be dismissed. Even the teachers began to shift. Mr. Delaney still tried to wear a stern expression, but when Noah raised his hand, He no longer ignored him. And Mr. Taylor, the science teacher who used to skip over him in presentations, now asked, "Noah, would you like to share your thoughts with class?" Noah nodded, not because he wanted recognition, but because he understood, once you're seen, you have a responsibility to speak up for what's right. That night, over a modest dinner at their old wooden table, Noah told his mother everything. He spoke of the silence that once surrounded him, of the eyes that used to look through him, and of the moment everything shifted. Because of one piece of music. His mother looked at him for a long moment, then gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to shout to be heard, but when you speak with truth, with talent, they will have to listen." Noah smiled. He understood more clearly than ever. Sometimes you don't need to defeat anyone to earn respect. You just have to be brave enough to stand when others only hope to see you fall. And he knew the most important lesson he had just learned wasn't from a textbook. It was from himself. A few weeks after performance, no one really brought up anymore. There were no awards, no school paper articles, no official recognition for Noah. But he didn't need any of that, because he knew he had been heard. Noah was still the quiet boy who sat by the window every morning. Still wore the same worn backpack. Still walked home down the leaf-covered sidewalk at the edge of the southern side of town. But the difference was in the way people looked at him now. No longer with emptiness. No longer with doubt. He didn't win with words, with arguments, or accusations. He didn't need to shout to prove he was worthy. All he needed was a piece of music. One piece played at the right moment. Just enough to make an entire classroom, even a teacher, stop and truly listen. From that day on, Mr. Delaney never spoke condescendingly to Noah again. Not because he had changed completely, but because he knew there were eyes watching now. There were limits. And there were students who wouldn't stay silent forever. One quiet weekend afternoon, Noah sat at the old piano inside Georgia Baptist Church, the one his grandfather used to play slow, aching jazz on years ago. He placed his hands on the keys, not to perform, not to impress, but to remind himself that music was what had kept him standing through it all. "Don't live to retaliate," his grandfather once said. "Live to reveal who you really are." Noah understood that now more than ever, he didn't need to become a symbol. He just needed to be himself, steady, clear-eyed, and never bow to prejudice. And he knew, if someday another student sat in the back of the classroom, overlooked the way he once was, then maybe, just maybe, that student wouldn't feel invisible anymore. Because Noah had once sat there, and he left behind an echo no one could erase.